Hey, good morning. It's Pastor Doug with you for another installment of our study in None of These Diseases. Hope that you are still finding some good insight from God's Word for practical living, and in particular, staying away from the diseases that the rest of the world has been experiencing, and probably far too many of us in the church because we have not heeded God's directions. This is chapter 7 that we're going through, and if you recall, our book is still from 1963. And while that part is dated of it, the truth of God's Word, even though it's much older, is purely up to date. This one, chapter 7, the title is The Enemies of Sexual Happiness. I know we don't talk a lot about sex in the church, and when we do, it tends to be negative. But in general, the story within the Scriptures is a very positive view of human sexuality as we enjoy it as God intended. We begin this chapter with a story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. You're probably familiar with that story about the flautist that enticed the young set with an enchanting, irresistible music. It was the tune they wanted to hear. They came into line. They followed the piper. They went to the mountain and into a cave, and it was never heard from again. And we don't want that to happen to any generation of young people. And hopefully we can learn the lessons, both of that wisdom as it's applied to God's Word. You know, every generation has a swarm of Pied Pipers. And back in the 50s, there was a very catchy tune that's still being played today, and it's the tune of sexual freedom. And by freedom, the emancipation from any tradition, particularly the religious traditions, that they saw hampering them from enjoying the best that sex has to offer. They wanted to escape the horrible confinement of religious inhibitions. Many of them, in pursuit of this, left their homes, left their spouses, left their loved ones, and they chased after these things, following that Pied Piper. And the one who was playing at that time was a renowned zoologist who gathered statistics on the theme of sex. His name was Dr. Alfred Kinsey, who collected a lot of data after he had interviewed 5,940 women, which sounds like a lot. He got these particular women, because they were willing to do the interview, to disclose to him in a way that he could share the details of their intimate relationships, both past and present encounters, those that were premarital as well as those within the marriage, and those that were extramarital. Those encounters that were in the confines of what we might consider normal, and those that we might say, well, atypical. Based on the percentages of what he heard from these women, he made calculations and conclusions that he extrapolated for what everyone else should be doing. Now, there is some problems with this data group that is pointed out in our study. He says, for one thing, there's only one woman for every 14,000 in the women at the U.S. at that time, which is not a great representation. The ratio of single women that he interviewed to those who were married was 3 times greater than the national average. The ratio of women in college to those who were not college age was 10 times greater than the national average. And all of those interviewed were, of course, willing to reveal those intimate details, which in itself shows a lack of inhibition. These women, according to Macmillan, were primarily atypical. And from his understanding and reading of the data in the study, that they were also masochistic. That is, they translated pain into a form of pleasure. The sampling was put forward as representative of what every woman should enjoy. More problems with his study was how his conclusions were made. If the average woman was engaged in an act, then it was considered advisable for any woman. Macmillan says, well, you know, the average Hindu drinks filthy water and gets cholera. So why would anybody want to do that? Just because the average person does it doesn't make it good. And since he was a zoologist, Kinsey classified women and hogs on the same level of their intimate endeavors. Kinsey could see no reason why a woman's sexual life should not be patterned that after a hog. A hog has no horrible inhibitions about sex, and neither should a woman, was his conclusion. Kinsey's basic conclusions are two. People should disregard the biblical warnings against fornication and adultery and homosexuality and other sexual behaviors. His second conclusion is that there should be no restriction placed on a person's individual sexual impulses, however wild or bizarre they might seem to someone else. Opposition in the medical and science community was huge at the time whenever Kinsey's report was released. A gynecologist and psychiatrist got together. They were so upset, so opposed to this report, that they wrote a book to refute Kinsey's erroneous conclusions, as did others in the Journal of American Medical Association and the Neurological Institute of New York, and lots of others. In general, I'm going to go to some of the reasons why they thought that this Kinsey report was terrible. They said, first of all, sexual behavior in subhuman species should not establish what is normal for the human interactions. Kinsey abandons the concept of perversion. That is, he does not advocate a particularly healthy standard because he considers all standards, all behaviors as perfectly healthy, one equaling the other. Emotionally, physically, socially, evidence says that there is a healthy standard when it comes to our sexual encounters, and there are perversions from it, and they have associated problems. Kinsey assured that even the spread of venereal disease, as we addressed in our last study, was relatively unimportant at that time. Medical cases and the emergence of resistant strains, as we talked about, show that he was just wrong. Kinsey is far more removed from the best medical opinions, and he made suggestions like this. A premarital petting that leads to orgasm prepares women to have successful marriages. Now, I don't want to get too far into that, and that may be too much for a Sunday school class to start with, but he made those kinds of claims all throughout his report, and the medical professionals were saying he's simply wrong about his conclusions. He did make conclusions about difficult medical relationships, about those who are involved in sexual encounters, but he did so without medical knowledge and clinical experience necessary for a full understanding of the principles involved, these medical professionals said. Early sexual encounters, especially those outside of what these professionals considered normal, and I don't know what that is, they just use that term, are the source, they said, of emotional conflict that led to neurotic and psychotic issues. So they were saying that, yes, good practices lead to good experiences and bad practices to bad experiences. But Kinsey said every practice leads to good experiences because it's all wonderful. And that's the song, the tune that he was playing. Now, there are some anecdotal evidences that are thrown into this book. The New York psychoanalyst spoke of a patient who was not tied to those horrible religious inhibitions, or any other for that matter. And she confessed, I've had 6 love affairs in the past 10 years, but I didn't seem to enjoy any of it. Is there something the matter with me? I feel like I'm not getting out of sex what I'm supposed to. Another psychiatrist, a confidant of those in Broadway and Hollywood, actors and actresses and those involved in that scene, all of whom lived that Kinsey-inspired promiscuous life. They each had, at least in his expression, 8, 10, 12 sexual affairs a year, all of whom confessed how frustrating and unsatisfied they were with all of it. A San Francisco health clinic who did a study of 2,000 girls, and these were ones who had admitted followed Kinsey's advice, they just asked the simple question, have you ever obtained even a transitory pleasure from your sexual experiences? You would think if Kinsey was right, then they should have all said yes, and not only a yes, a resounding yes, and we have had one wonderful sexual experience after another. But only a third of them said they had some pleasure. 2/3 of them reported doubt, guilt, shame, indifference, and saw their sexual encounters as unpleasant. and they were longing for something more. The more, of course, we know is God's alternative. He created sexual urges in men and women, and he created the place for those urges to be met and expressed in a way that was healthy, that was normal, and that was good. His plan was for them to be met in a marriage between one man and one woman. The scriptures talk about the marriage being honorable. That is, it's a good place for this expression. And that the bed is to be undefiled. It's to be kept for just that man and woman together. And that he is going to judge those who go beyond those boundaries. Judge them because they are damaging other people, and they are bringing hurt and hopelessness and disappointment and even diseases into their lives, and they'll be judged for that poor choice and behavior. God's restraints are not to diminish sexual enjoyment, but to keep it on track so that women and men can achieve the maximum of pleasure in it. He gives an illustration that he uses through the rest of the book about a cow that breaks a fence that's surrounding a very lush pasture that has water, it has the green grass, it has everything that it needs, but it does not want to be there, so it breaks through the fence and it goes out in the desert to where it starves and is diseased and is preyed upon, rather than remaining where it was good. And sometimes you've got to go out in that harsh territory to realize just how good it was back using God's ways. The results of Kinsey's paths have a lot of problems with it. It says there's the problem of illegitimate children. At the time, the rates were increasing. What are we going to do with these illegitimate children, these single parents, and how are we going to have to involve that whole way of parenting and the help for those parents? Of course, one of the solutions that has come along since then is abortion. We'll just get rid of those children so that they're not a problem. Others have tried to figure out how to compensate. How do we do single parenting? How do we involved in that? Divorce rates climbed because of those following Kinsey. Marriage rates decreased, not even wanting to get in it to start with. Psychiatric caseloads have skyrocketed. And those suffering from feeling like they need to keep quiet about what they have done, even though they got away with it, are suffering silently with hurts and regrets and loss of self-respect and hopelessness, and feeling they have a secret that didn't satisfy, and now they are stuck with living a lie. Macmillan's experience said that girls, and this is mostly a study about women, are impacted for the rest of their lives. And it manifests in more than just these psychological and emotional troubles. He says that it's the root of many psychosomatic diseases. He says, in the cow illustration, breaking through the fence around God's good sex is the basic cause of what only a physician comes to know about their patients. He says for him, and of course he's changed the names and just picked them out, it's the cause of Cassie's toxic goiter, Helen's arthritis, Suzanne's commitment to the insane asylum. He didn't explain how all those things were, but he is prone to make his case in a dramatic fashion. He says, true, these girls were not confined to the horrible religious inhibitions, but they were opened up to diseases and heartache and sorrow and emotional and psychological diseases that they would otherwise been protected from. He says the real enemy of sexual happiness are those who entice a person from home and family and, yes, biblical standards. Jesus' standard of promoting from the beginning, they're made male and female. From the beginning, the man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife, and they become one, is not new, but it is good. That is, not all non-religious things are good. Jesus' advice, God's advice is great. It's what leads to a happy marriage, which leads to a happy sexual experience. Unlike some religious and philosophical systems, medical advice, the Bible takes a very positive view of human sexuality. There's nothing shameful in the physical expressions of lovemaking. You can go back to Proverbs 5:18 and 19, Ecclesiastes 9:9, or even that famous Song of Solomon, in particular, that uses such powerful language to describe love's passion and couches it in a positive, good way, even sometimes as an example of how people are supposed to love God himself. Paul strikes the same positive note in his letters to Corinth and to his letters to Timothy whenever they were at Ephesus. Sexual vice was rampant in both of those ancient cities, partly in a reaction to this. There were a lot of negative attitudes that started being embraced by the church. There was an ascetic attitude that said to take control of the life of Christians, trying to figure out, what do we do here? Marriage was being decried. That's 1 Timothy 4:3. And married couples were abandoning their sexual relationships with one another and believing that this would help them become more spiritually mature. 1 Corinthians 7:5. There were even some men who thought it was good for a man not to get married in the first place. Paul has no hesitation of branding such attitudes as heretical. Recalling his readers to the message of Genesis, he encourages them to receive the gifts that God has given us and do so thankfully. 1 Timothy 4:3-5. He says that husbands and wives are to be mutually obligated to express their love for one another, not forsaking one another, but meeting one another's and enjoying one another's sexual company. Physical lovemaking in marriage is as much as part of what God says when you are to honor God with your body as refusing sex with someone other than your spouse. At the end, we kind of have to say there's just simply really two purposes in the Scriptures for our sexual encounters inside marriage. The most obvious one is for procreation. It's for having children, for expanding our families. And it's something that the church strongly affirms because it's affirmed in the Scriptures. In the days when the focus of interest in our Western world is on the prevention of births, it's important to note that the Bible takes an insistence that having children is a very special blessing from which married couples should be thankful for God, that they're now entering into this time when they get to raise a child and have the joys of that and all the experiences that come with it. The second purpose in marriage is for that couple, that man and woman, to be completely united as one. The Bible's advice for anyone who has that threatened by some simple sexual temptation is simply run away from it. It is not worth it. Joseph is often used as the example whenever another man's wife comes to him and wants to go to bed with him. And he is so adamant about running away, he leaves his cloak with her in hand and runs out of the house. And Paul tells Christian readers, you just need to follow Joseph's example whenever someone tries to threaten the sanctity and the enjoyment of the sexual relationships we have within marriage. 1 Corinthians 6:1-18, 2 Timothy 2:22. This is an acknowledgement of the power of the normal person's sex drive, not a counsel about despair about it. God made us this way. We have those longings, and He has given us His Spirit, and He's given us His direction and His wisdom to say that there is a place for us to enjoy that, and there are ways for us to avoid. There's a healthy, good standard for us to reach to, and there are perversions of it that lead us toward heartache and sorrow and disease. And if you want none of these diseases, and you want the happiness that comes from the sexual encounter that God created, then we need to do it in His ways. In that way, we will enjoy the very best that God has to offer for us. That's our lesson for this morning. I hope that it has made you think a little more and maybe give you an even greater joy and thankfulness to God, and that you might put His word into practice.